Have you ever wondered what happens when you have spent so much time looking inward that one day you suddenly realize you no longer recognize the person you used to be? Not because you have become someone completely different, but because the things that once controlled you no longer seem to have the same power. You react differently. You choose differently. You become quieter in situations where you once felt the need to defend yourself. You walk away from things you once desperately tried to hold on to. And perhaps most strangely of all, you begin to feel as though life itself is changing around you, even though you are not consciously trying to change it. According to Carl Jung, the journey into the unconscious is not simply about discovering everything that is wrong with you. It is about becoming aware of the parts of yourself that were pushed into the darkness, understanding why they were rejected, and gradually becoming more whole. This is why the end of shadow work does not necessarily feel like a dramatic victory. There may be no extraordinary moment when everything suddenly becomes clear. Instead, the transformation can be so subtle that you only recognize it when you look backward and realize that the person who once struggled with the same things is no longer there in quite the same way. Your external circumstances may still contain problems. People may still disappoint you. You may still experience fear, sadness, uncertainty, and difficult days. But something fundamental has shifted inside you. You are no longer living from the same unconscious patterns. And when that happens, strange things begin to change. Not because the universe has suddenly decided to reward you, but because your relationship with yourself has changed so deeply that your choices, relationships, attention, and even your perception of life begin to reorganize themselves around that change. In this video, we are going to explore 6 powerful things that can begin to happen when your shadow work reaches a mature stage. Blindly leaving your body. The second may feel like intuition becoming clearer. The third may change the way you understand people and situations. The fourth may cause parts of your old life to quietly disappear. The fifth may bring back abilities you thought you had lost forever. But the sixth is the one that matters most, because it asks a difficult question. After everything you have learned about yourself, are you actually living as yourself? Or have you simply created a more sophisticated version of the same old mask? The first thing that begins to change is the amount of energy you spend fighting yourself. For years, you may have believed that your exhaustion came from your responsibilities, your job, your relationships, or the constant pressure of modern life. And sometimes those things genuinely are exhausting. But there is another form of exhaustion that is much harder to recognize because it happens entirely inside you. It happens when one part of you wants something, while another part immediately tells you that you should not want it. One part of you wants to speak while another is terrified of being judged. One part wants to leave while another is desperate to be accepted. One part wants to rest while another tells you that resting means you are lazy. One part wants to become visible while another remembers all the times visibility resulted in criticism, rejection, or humiliation. When these opposing forces continue for years, an enormous amount of psychological energy can be consumed without you realizing where it is going. You may appear productive on the outside while internally feeling as though you are constantly carrying something heavy. This is one reason shadow work can eventually produce a strange kind of quietness. You do not necessarily become happier every morning. You do not suddenly stop having difficult emotions. Instead, you stop wasting so much energy trying to convince yourself that certain emotions should not exist. You begin to understand that fear does not make you weak, anger does not automatically make you cruel, sadness does not make you broken, and wanting something does not make you selfish. The emotion can exist without becoming your master. That distinction is incredibly important. Integration does not mean allowing every impulse to control your behavior. It means becoming conscious enough to understand what is happening inside you before deciding how you will respond. Imagine a river that has been flowing for years while countless rocks block its path. The water is still moving, but much of its energy is wasted crashing against the obstacles, turning backward and squeezing through tiny spaces. Now imagine that the rocks are gradually removed. The river does not suddenly receive more water. It simply stops wasting so much energy fighting against what blocks its natural movement. Something similar can happen psychologically. When you stop spending every day suppressing, denying, performing, and defending different parts of yourself, The energy that was trapped inside those conflicts becomes available for living. You may suddenly have more patience. You may become more creative. You may discover that you can concentrate for longer. You may notice that conversations no longer exhaust you in the same way. You may even wake up one morning and realize that you have not spent the first hour of your day worrying about whether you are good enough. This is often misunderstood because people expect healing to feel like excitement. But mature healing can feel surprisingly ordinary. It can feel like relief. It can feel like breathing more deeply without consciously trying. It can feel like sitting alone in a quiet room and realizing that you are not desperately trying to escape your own thoughts anymore. You have stopped treating yourself as an enemy. Perhaps you once needed everyone around you to approve of your choices because disapproval activated something much older inside you. Perhaps you used to explain yourself endlessly whenever someone misunderstood you. Perhaps you could not say no without feeling guilty. Perhaps you constantly replayed conversations because you were trying to determine whether someone was disappointed in you. These patterns may not disappear overnight, but as the shadow becomes more conscious, something begins to change. You start recognizing the fear underneath the behavior. And once you recognize the fear, you no longer have to obey it automatically. This is one of the first signs that your inner world is becoming less fragmented. You are not becoming emotionless. You are becoming less divided. And there is a major difference between the two. A person who is emotionally numb may appear peaceful because they have disconnected from what they feel. A person who has integrated more of themselves can experience difficult emotions while remaining present with them. They can say, "I am afraid," without immediately concluding, "Therefore I must run." They can say, "I am angry," without immediately concluding, "Therefore I must attack." They can say, "I want this," without immediately concluding, "Therefore I must have it." The space between emotion and action becomes larger, and inside that space, freedom begins to appear. If you have recently noticed that you are less interested in fighting yourself, less interested in proving yourself, or less desperate to be understood by everyone around you, do not assume that nothing is happening simply because the transformation feels quiet. Sometimes the absence of inner conflict is itself evidence that something profound has changed. And once that inner conflict begins to settle, another strange thing happens. You may discover that you no longer need to think so hard about every decision. For a long time, perhaps you believed that being careful meant analyzing everything. You would examine every conversation, every opportunity, every relationship, and every possible outcome. You would ask yourself what the correct decision was. You would search for signs that you were making a mistake. You might even ask several people for their opinions because trusting your own judgment felt dangerous. But when the unconscious patterns behind those doubts become more visible, something begins to shift. You start recognizing the difference between genuine uncertainty and fear, pretending to be uncertainty. You begin to notice when you are actually thinking through a problem and when you are simply trying to avoid the discomfort of making a decision. This distinction can change your life. During the early stages of personal growth, conscious effort is necessary. You have to remind yourself not to repeat an old pattern. You have to notice when you are people-pleasing. You have to remind yourself to establish boundaries. You have to pause before reacting. You have to consciously choose something different. This can feel exhausting because every new behavior requires attention. But with time, some of those choices become integrated into the way you naturally operate. Think about learning to drive. In the beginning, every movement requires conscious attention. You think about the pedals, the steering wheel, the mirrors, the road, the signs, and the traffic around you. Years later, you can perform many of these actions without consciously narrating every movement. The skill has become integrated. Psychological growth can develop in a similar way. At first, you consciously practice self-awareness. Eventually, self-awareness becomes part of the way you naturally move through life. You may notice that you leave an unhealthy conversation before it becomes an argument, not because you remembered a self-help rule, but because something inside you simply recognizes that the conversation is no longer productive. You may say no without preparing a 20-minute explanation. You may stop chasing someone who repeatedly shows you that they do not want to meet you halfway. You may choose rest without having to convince yourself that you deserve it. You may speak honestly without rehearsing every possible reaction. This does not mean you become infallible. In fact, genuine psychological maturity usually includes a greater willingness to admit that you can be wrong. The difference is that you no longer need perfection before taking action. You can make a decision, observe the consequences, and adjust. You trust yourself enough to correct yourself. This is closely related to Jung's idea of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming more fully oneself, rather than simply becoming the person that family, society, or collective expectations demand. Individuation is not about building an impressive identity. It is about becoming more conscious of the different parts of yourself and developing a relationship with them. The more conscious you become, the less you need to live according to a script written entirely by other people. And this is where something even more surprising begins to happen. You may discover that your intuition becomes quieter but stronger. It is not the dramatic voice people sometimes describe as a mystical feeling. It can be much simpler. You walk into a situation and immediately notice that something is not right. You cannot explain every detail yet, but you recognize a familiar pattern. Or you meet someone and realize that you do not need to impress them. Or you receive an opportunity that looks perfect on paper but feels deeply disconnected from who you are becoming. The important point is that intuition should not be confused with impulse. An impulse demands immediate action. Intuition can tolerate observation. It does not need to scream. It can wait. This is why becoming more conscious can make intuition more useful. You become better at distinguishing the quiet perception of a pattern from the loud demands of fear or desire. And once your internal perception becomes clearer, the third strange thing begins to happen. The world does not necessarily change, but you begin seeing it differently. The same people may be around you. The same streets may lead to the same places. The same problems may still exist. Yet something about your perception becomes different. You begin noticing patterns that were always there, but that you previously could not see because your attention was occupied by your own unresolved conflicts. Imagine walking through a familiar neighborhood while wearing headphones that are playing extremely loud music. You have walked the same streets many times, but you never notice the sound of birds, the rhythm of footsteps, the distant conversations, or the subtle changes in the environment. Then one day the volume decreases. The neighborhood has not changed. Your ability to perceive it has. This is one way to understand what can happen after deep inner work. When your attention is no longer consumed by constantly monitoring yourself, defending yourself, or worrying about what others think, more of your awareness becomes available for reality itself. You may start noticing how someone speaks rather than simply listening to whether they approve of you. You may notice that a friend repeatedly asks for your support, but rarely asks how you are doing. You may notice that you always become anxious around a particular person because they activate an old pattern. You may notice that a job you once considered successful has slowly become incompatible with your values. You may notice that certain conversations repeatedly lead you toward the same emotional state. This is not necessarily becoming suspicious of everyone. It is becoming observant. Jung's work repeatedly returned to the idea that what remains unconscious can influence behavior without being recognized. When you begin making those unconscious patterns more conscious, ordinary events can become psychologically meaningful. Not because every coincidence is a supernatural message, but because you are finally capable of recognizing connections between your inner world and the situations you repeatedly encounter. Perhaps you suddenly realize why a particular type of relationship has appeared in your life again and again. Perhaps you recognize that you have been attracted to people who recreate an emotional dynamic from your childhood. Perhaps you understand that your intense reaction to criticism is connected to an old wound, rather than simply the words someone said today. Perhaps you realize that what you call bad luck was sometimes a pattern you unconsciously participated in. This realization can be uncomfortable because it removes the simplicity of blaming everything outside yourself, but it is also empowering. If you can see your participation in a pattern, you can begin changing it. A person might spend years saying, "I always attract people who abandon me." Then, after deeper reflection, they may discover that they repeatedly choose emotionally unavailable people because emotional distance feels familiar. This does not mean they cause someone else's behavior. It means they can begin examining why that particular dynamic felt attractive or safe to them. And that is where shadow work becomes more than simply thinking about your past. It begins influencing your present. The fourth strange thing that can happen is that your external life begins to readjust. This is often where people become confused because they may feel as though the world itself is responding to their inner transformation. Suddenly, certain friendships become less frequent. Certain environments feel uncomfortable. A job that once seemed perfect no longer fits. Habits that once provided comfort become strangely empty. Meanwhile, new interests, people, opportunities, and possibilities begin appearing. It can feel almost as though life is rearranging itself. But there is a more grounded psychological explanation. When your identity changes, your choices change. When your choices change, your behavior changes. When your behavior changes, the environments and relationships you maintain can change as well. Imagine a person who spent years saying yes to everything because they were terrified of disappointing people. Their schedule becomes filled with obligations. Their relationships become built around their availability. Their identity becomes the reliable one. Then they begin doing shadow work and realize that their constant availability was partly driven by fear. They begin saying no. They stop volunteering for every responsibility. They become more honest about what they can and cannot give. At first, people around them may be surprised. Some may even become disappointed. But eventually, the relationships that depended entirely on their self-sacrifice may weaken, while relationships capable of adapting to the new boundaries may become stronger. From the outside, it may look like their life suddenly changed. Internally, however, they changed the rules by which they were participating in that life. This is why the end of shadow work should not be interpreted as a promise that everything will magically become easy. Sometimes becoming more authentic makes life temporarily more difficult. You may lose approval. You may disappoint people. You may leave environments where you once felt secure. You may have to face uncertainty because the old identity no longer works. But there is a difference between losing something because you were unconscious and letting something go because you have become conscious enough to recognize that it no longer belongs to you. A woman may spend 10 years working in an environment that gives her status but leaves her feeling empty. For years, she tells herself that she should be grateful. She ignores the discomfort because admitting it would force her to question the identity she has built. Eventually, through reflection, she realizes that much of her attachment to the job was connected to the need to prove that she was successful. She does not immediately quit. Instead, she begins exploring what actually matters to her. She changes her schedule. She develops a neglected interest. She begins having conversations she had avoided for years. Months later, an unexpected opportunity appears. She does not know whether it will work. But for the first time, she is not choosing simply to protect an identity. She is choosing based on what feels aligned with the person she has become. That is the subtle way external life can reorganize itself. Sometimes a door closes. Sometimes you close it. Sometimes you realize you have been standing in front of a door that was never yours. And sometimes a new door appears only because you finally stopped spending all your energy trying to keep the old one open. This leads to the fifth transformation, and for many people it is one of the most beautiful. You may begin rediscovering abilities, interests, emotions, and qualities that you thought had disappeared. There are parts of ourselves that do not disappear because they were weak. They disappear because they were inconvenient. A child may love drawing until someone tells them that art is useless. A teenager may love asking questions until they are repeatedly told they are annoying. A naturally sensitive person may learn to hide their sensitivity because it was treated as weakness. A person with leadership ability may make themselves smaller because standing out once resulted in criticism. Someone may love writing but stop because they were told their ideas were unrealistic. Over time, these qualities can move out of conscious awareness. You may eventually say, "I am just not creative anymore," or "I was never really confident," or "I don't know what I want." But perhaps the quality was never gone. Perhaps it was simply buried. This is one reason the concept of the shadow is more complicated than simply a collection of negative traits. The unconscious can contain qualities that were rejected because they did not fit the identity a person believed they were allowed to have. A person can bury anger, but they can also bury ambition. They can bury vulnerability, but they can also bury creativity. They can reject selfishness and accidentally reject healthy self-interest along with it. They can reject arrogance and accidentally reject the confidence to be visible. The work of integration is therefore not simply about becoming nicer, calmer, or more positive. It is about becoming more whole. Imagine a garden that has been neglected for years. From a distance, it looks dead. The ground is covered with weeds and dry leaves. You might assume there is nothing alive underneath. But when the layers are gradually cleared, small plants begin appearing. The gardener did not create those plants. The gardener simply removed what was covering them. Something similar can happen inside a person. You may suddenly discover that you enjoy reading again. You may begin writing. You may return to music. You may become interested in learning something you once loved. You may discover that you enjoy speaking to people. You may finally allow yourself to take up space in a room without apologizing for existing. And the strangest part is that it may not feel like becoming someone new. It may feel like remembering someone you had forgotten. Perhaps you once had a dream that seemed childish. Perhaps you once imagined building something, creating something, helping people, traveling, learning, or expressing yourself in a way that your old identity did not permit. You abandoned it because life became serious. Responsibilities arrived. Fear became practical. Other people's expectations became louder. Then, years later, something inside you quietly asks, "What happened to that part of me?" That question can be the beginning of a powerful return. But there is another important distinction. Rediscovering yourself does not mean returning to your childhood exactly as you were. It means carrying forward the qualities that still belong to you while integrating them into the person you have become. A mature person does not become a child again. They become an adult who has recovered something the child once knew. Curiosity can return without naivety. Creativity can return without irresponsibility. Sensitivity can return with boundaries. Confidence can return without arrogance. Ambition can return without the need to prove worth. This is what makes integration different from regression. And after all these changes, something begins to emerge that is much harder to measure. You may become less interested in performing your transformation. This brings us to the sixth and most important sign. The final test of shadow work is not how much you know about psychology. It is not how many books you have read. It is not how often you meditate. It is not how calm you appear. It is not whether you can explain Jungian concepts better than the people around you. The final test is whether you are honest with yourself. Because there is a strange danger that can appear after a person has spent years working on themselves. The ego can simply create a new identity around the work. In the past, you may have identified with being successful. Now you identify with being awakened. In the past, you needed people to admire you for your achievements. Now you need them to admire you for your wisdom. In the past, you wanted to be better than others because of your status. Now you may want to be better than others because of your consciousness. The costume changes. The psychological mechanism may not. This is why genuine growth can become uncomfortable again at the very moment you believe you have arrived. A person may say, "I am healed," and then become defensive whenever someone points out a problem. They may say, "I trust my intuition," while refusing to examine whether their intuition is actually fear. They may say, "I have detached," when what they have really done is become emotionally unavailable. They may say, "I have boundaries," when what they have created is a wall that prevents intimacy. They may say, "I no longer care what people think," while secretly hoping everyone recognizes how independent they have become. The ego is extremely adaptable. It can turn almost anything into an identity. That is why the deepest form of shadow work is not becoming convinced that you are finally finished. It is developing enough humility to know that there will always be parts of yourself you cannot see immediately. This does not mean becoming insecure or endlessly questioning yourself. It means remaining open to reality. If someone you trust tells you that you are becoming arrogant, can you listen without immediately deciding they are jealous if you make a mistake? Can you admit it without constructing an elaborate explanation for why it was actually someone else's fault? If someone disagrees with you, can you remain curious instead of needing to prove that they are less conscious than you? If your behavior hurts someone, can you care about the impact, even if your intention was good? These are not glamorous tests, but they are real ones. A man may spend years studying psychology and eventually become the person everyone asks for advice. At first, He listens carefully. He shares what he has learned while remembering that he is still learning himself. Over time, however, he begins believing that he understands people better than everyone else. When a friend disagrees with him, he assumes the friend is simply not self-aware enough. One day, someone close to him says something simple. You don't listen anymore. You are only waiting for your turn to explain why you're right. Those words hurt because they reveal something he could not see by himself. But if he is willing to listen, the criticism becomes part of his growth. That moment may be more valuable than everything he previously learned. Because the goal of shadow work is not to create a person who never has a shadow again. The goal is to become someone who can recognize the shadow when it appears. This is why psychological maturity often looks less impressive from the outside than people expect. The truly mature person does not need to constantly announce how mature they are. They can say, I was wrong. They can say, I don't know. They can say, I need to think about that. They can say, I hurt you, and I understand why. They can say, I thought I had healed this, but apparently there is still something here for me to understand. There is tremendous strength in those sentences, and perhaps this is where the entire journey comes together. At the beginning of shadow work, you may think the goal is to eliminate the darkness. Then you discover that the darkness contains information. You begin understanding your fears, your projections, your defenses, your desires, your anger, your shame, and your hidden qualities. Then you realize that the goal was never to become purely light. The goal was to become whole. And when you become more whole, your relationship with life changes. You stop asking, how can I make everyone accept me? You begin asking, what is actually true for me? You stop asking, how can I avoid ever being hurt? You begin asking, how can I remain open without abandoning myself? You stop asking, how can I become impressive? You begin asking, what kind of life would actually feel meaningful if nobody were watching? You stop asking, how can I prove that I have changed? You begin living differently without needing to prove anything. That may be the strangest thing that happens when shadow work ends. Nothing magical has to happen. Your life may still contain bills, responsibilities, difficult conversations, uncertainty, disappointment, and ordinary mornings. But you are no longer approaching those things from exactly the same psychological position. You may still become afraid, but you recognize the fear. You may still become angry, but you recognize what the anger is protecting. You may still become insecure, but you no longer automatically build your identity around the insecurity. You may still fail, but failure no longer has to become a verdict about your worth. You may still lose people, but you no longer have to lose yourself in order to keep them. And slowly, almost invisibly, your life begins to change. The people you choose may change. The conversations you tolerate may change. The way you spend your time may change. The things you desire may change. The things you once thought were essential may become strangely unimportant. And the things you ignored because they seemed too small may suddenly become meaningful. A quiet morning, an honest conversation, a walk without your phone, a piece of music, a page in a book, a creative idea, a moment when you choose not to react. These ordinary things can begin carrying a depth they did not seem to have before. Not because the world has become magical, but because you are finally present enough to experience it. Perhaps this is the real meaning behind the strange changes that can follow deep inner work. The world does not necessarily rearrange itself around you. You begin relating to the world differently. And because your perception changes, your decisions change. Because your decisions change, your behavior changes. Because your behavior changes, your relationships change. Because your relationships change, your environment changes. And eventually, when you look back, it can feel as though your entire life transformed without one dramatic moment ever announcing the beginning of that transformation. It happened quietly, one boundary at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one unconscious pattern recognized at a time, one fear faced instead of avoided, one old identity released, One forgotten part of yourself welcomed home. And perhaps that is why the end of shadow work can feel strangely anticlimactic. You expect fireworks. Instead, you get peace. You expect to become extraordinary. Instead, you become more comfortable being ordinary. You expect to discover a perfect version of yourself. Instead, you become more capable of accepting the imperfect person who has been there all along. You expect the darkness to disappear. Instead, you learn how to carry light into it. And maybe that is what Carl Jung's deeper psychological vision ultimately points toward. Not becoming a person who has no contradictions, no fears, no wounds, or no unconscious material, but becoming someone who can hold more of themselves consciously. Someone who can acknowledge both strength and weakness, both confidence and uncertainty, both independence and the need for connection, both ambition and rest, both light and shadow. Because wholeness does not mean that every part of you agrees. It means that no essential part of you has to remain completely exiled. So if you have been doing shadow work and recently noticed strange changes in your life, do not immediately assume that something is wrong simply because the transformation feels unfamiliar. Perhaps you are beginning to experience less inner conflict. Perhaps you are becoming more decisive. Perhaps you are noticing patterns that were invisible before. Perhaps relationships are changing. Perhaps forgotten abilities are returning. Or perhaps you are simply becoming more honest about who you are. And if none of these things feel dramatic, that may actually be the point. The deepest transformations rarely announce themselves. They reveal themselves through the way you respond to an ordinary Tuesday, through the conversation where you finally tell the truth, through the relationship you no longer chase, through the opportunity you finally accept, through the boundary you finally maintain, through the mistake you finally admit, through the part of yourself you finally stop being ashamed of. That is when you know something has changed. Not because you feel like a completely different person, but because you no longer need to keep becoming someone else. And perhaps the final mystery is this: when your shadow work ends, your life does not necessarily become easier. It becomes more honest. You begin seeing yourself without so many filters. You begin seeing other people without needing them to fulfill a role in your story. You begin seeing your past not simply as something that happened to you, but as something you can understand without allowing it to dictate every part of your future. You stop trying to erase your history. You begin integrating it. You stop trying to become perfect. You begin becoming whole. And when that happens, everything begins to change. Not overnight, not magically, not because the world suddenly decided to give you what you wanted, but because the person experiencing the world is no longer the same person who once needed everything outside of them to change first. Maybe that is the real ending of shadow work, not the disappearance of the shadow, not the achievement of permanent happiness, not the creation of some enlightened identity, but the quiet moment when you realize that you no longer need to run from yourself. You can sit with your fear, you can listen to your anger, you can acknowledge your weakness, you can appreciate your strength, you can admit when you are wrong, you can change without hating the person you used to be, and you can finally walk through life without constantly asking whether you are enough. Because somewhere along the journey you discovered something much more important than becoming enough. You discovered that you were never meant to become somebody else. You were meant to become more fully yourself. And perhaps that is why, when your shadow work ends, everything begins to change. The world may look almost exactly the same, but you are finally seeing it with different eyes.